Thank you so much to professors, Ambassador, Madam Vice President for that really rich discussion. All of us were just able to take part in on AI laws, not just where they stand, but the role they're currently serving in our society and where they might serve. If we think a little bit more critically about how AI is being used and that role that it's going to increasingly be playing across that society. Now, one of the themes that you heard over and over again during that discussion was this notion of trust. And as Ambassador Ndemo mentioned, trust derived from being confident that what we're being told about a system is the truth and being told it consistently. So the question, of course, is how do we know that AI systems are doing what we design them to do? And just as importantly, when we interrogate them, that they're not just telling us what we want to hear. What level of confidence, in other words, do we need for those systems, particularly given the variety of ways in which they might be used, ways that are in some contexts extremely socially important, but others that might be less so? And our next panel is going to explore just that. Auditing and monitoring AI systems. And that panel is going to be led by one of the leaders of the AIPF, former foreign minister and finance minister of Mexico, and now senior lecturer at MIT Sloan School of Management and director of the MIT AI Policy for the World project, my friend and colleague, Luis Videgaray. Luis, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And we are very thankful to our panelists and to the audience for joining us this morning or this afternoon from wherever in the world you are joining us. And we are really excited about this discussion. And it's not very frequent that you think about auditing and get excited, but we really think that this is a topic that is at the very core of responsible, trustworthy AI deployment. And for these, to discuss these issues, we have a stellar panel. And I would like our panelists to introduce themselves, and we will do it in strict alphabetical order. So let's start with Diane. Diane Lai, from Capital One, the Executive Vice President, CIO of Card & Small Business Technology. Diane, tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. Thank you for including me in the panel today. I lead the technology organization for Capital One's credit card business. And in that role, I have responsibility for the technology that includes a significant set of both traditional statistical models and AI-enabled models that we use to make decisions primarily around fraud detection, but also in other ways as well. And so I'm here as a practitioner, as somebody who's managing these systems day in, day out, and trying to make sure that we're doing the right thing always for our customers when we use this technology.
Thank you, Diana. We're really looking forward to learning from you and your day-to-day experience. Next is our own professor at MIT, Aleksander Madry. Aleksander, you are a star here at MIT, but you can share a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you, Luis, and welcome everyone. So yeah, my name is Aleksander Madry. I'm a faculty here in the ECS department, and also, a complete coincidence, I'm also a colleague of the AIPF, so the AI Policy Forum. So my research is about understanding, what does it take and how to make our machine learning to be at the stage where we can deploy them broadly in a responsible and reliable manner. So clearly, auditing is something that I'm thinking quite a bit from the technical and research point of view, and I'm happy to share whatever thoughts I have in this context. Thank you.
Thank you, Aleksander. Elem Tabasi, you play a crucial role in the U.S. deployment of AI, and at your role at NIST, at US NIST. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and I'm super grateful for the opportunity to be here among many leaders of the field. Elem Tabasi, I joined NIST a little over 20 years ago, and my first project was development of an open vocabulary speaker recognition, and that got me with a background in computer vision machine learning. That got me into a lot more applications of biometrics. In the past 3-4 years, I have been leading the Trustworthy Responsible AI program at NIST. We have ongoing efforts, research and developing a framework that provide standards, evaluations, and technical foundations to advance trustworthy, responsible AI. And of course, the first step of that is to understand what trustworthy, responsible means. The development of the AI risk management framework it adopts a rights-preserving approach, and we aim to operationalize values outlined in many high-level documents, such as OECD AI recommendations into AI systems. So look forward to discussions about all of these things with all of you.
Thank you, Ellen, and really looking forward to learning from you. Let's go now to Paris. Renaud, he is the ministerial coordinator for AI at the government of France. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Renaud.
Hello, Luis. Hello, everybody. In effect, my mission is to serve as the coordination of the French national strategy for AI. And with this framework, we are financing and leading a program around trustworthy AI, which is quite industrial in nature, and which attempts to develop self-assessment and auditing methods, certification, and also running a standardization program, or rather participation to international standardization movement. And we are also involved as an EU member state in the negotiation of the AI Act, and this semester with even more commitment due to the French temporary presidency of the European Council. So I'm very honored to be with you today.
Thank you, Renaud, and we are honored about all of you joining us. All of you, we have, as you can see, we have a great combination of an industry practitioner, 2 government representatives, 1 from Europe, 1 from the US, and of course, a leading academic from MIT. So why are we doing this panel? Why are we so interested in this subject? Well, if you look around into pretty much any discussion about artificial intelligence policy, you meet a call for a methodical examination of AI systems in order to properly identify and therefore mitigate risks, and to ensure that the attributes of these systems, whether they be purely technical, like their accuracy or their robustness, or socio-technical attributes like privacy or inequities or lack of bias, are duly protected. And there are, we saw in the previous panel, there are many approaches to AI policy and regulation. But this particular point seems to be a consensus. Everybody agrees that the system should be examined in some way or another. And we are referring to this as AI auditing and monitoring. And this includes pre-market and post-market, and really refers to the whole life cycle of a model, as the model, as typically machine learning systems change throughout their life. So, but everybody agrees on this, but there is very little thought about whether this is really possible from a technical perspective, from a human resources, from an institutional capabilities, and that is what this panel is about. The first challenge, and this is the first thing I'd like to focus on, and I'd like to start with Ilham, which is, what are we talking about when we talk about evaluating a model or the assessment of an AI system, or the auditing and monitoring of AI system? It seems that the first step that we need to cover is terminology. But beyond terminology, there's a more fundamental issue, which is, what are we auditing for? What are the objectives? Because there are many potential problems. So Ilham, you are working according to the US National AI Initiative Act, you are working on developing a risk management framework about AI. What are your perspectives on the objectives and terminology about this process?
Yeah, thank you for that questions. It's extremely important and extremely fundamental questions. You talked about evaluations and examinations to make sure that the system or algorithm meets its critical objectives for functionality, interoperability, and now more and more trustworthiness, to ensure that they perform accurately, reliably, safely. And you also touched on the socio-technical characteristics, such as privacy and mitigation bias, I want to add another dimension to the need for evaluations, and that is to advance the science and technology to understand limits and capabilities and be able to understand the failure modes, so the scientists and technologists can propel technology forward and come with the better systems and better science. And at NIST, we are all a fan of this quote from Lord Kelvin that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So if you want to improve the technology, we ought to be able to measure it, but also the measurement for the audit and assuring that it works properly is also important. If we want to measure something, the first thing is to understand the measurements, what it is that we want to measure. And that's where the terminology that you mentioned becomes extremely important. And it's often the case that we use the same term meaning two different things. And it becomes even more complicated when we are bringing the definitions among scientists and technologists and the definitions in law and regulatory policy next to each other. So even terms such as bias can have very different meanings in different versions of the law or different disciplines. And the previous panel also was talking about sectors, so how bias manifests or show itself and what it means in, I don't know, face recognition can be very different than some other aspects. You mentioned the AI risk management framework, and one of the first things that we very intentionally spent time on it and focus on it with the help and engagement of the community was coming up with a taxonomy of risk. I'm going back within risk and trustworthiness because we see that at the two sides of the same coin. So if we are talking about trustworthiness, what do we mean? And there were discussions in the past previous panel about trust, what constitutes trust. So what we're trying to do is from the technical and socio-technical angle, come up with a taxonomy for risk, the core building blocks of trustworthiness, and then bring the whole community on a shared understanding of what we mean by each of them, so that we have the right foundations and an interoperable way of talking about what it is to measure, which hopefully gets us into the right methods of measurement, the metrics, the data sets needed for measurement. I'll stop here and just say that, yes, when there has, the good thing is that there is a lot of will, there's a lot of energy. We have seen a lot of really good high-level value-based documents that talk about values that we want to see in AI systems. Just recently, AI Bill of Rights, of course, the White House is working on that and discussing that and socializing that. The opportunity for us, the tech and science community, is to take these high-level value-based statements, translate them into more practical terms that the systems can be designed, developed, and more importantly, tested based on those.
Thank you very much, Ilham. I see both Diane and Aleksander have unmuted themselves, so I presume that both are going to contribute. Let's go to you, Diane, first.
Thank you. I think that's such an important set of comments that Alan just made. I would add to that I don't think we have to start the process of really understanding how to audit and how to manage AI models in production from scratch. At least in the financial services industry, we have a long history of regulation and governance, audit and control around our use of statistical models. And what we've seen in financial services is statistical models that have been in use for 20, 30 years at this point are gradually being supplanted by models that have many more of the characteristics of AI systems. And I think the regulatory framework that we've all benefited from, that's created in financial services a common language for us to use, and that has created for institutions a really well-established set of processes around the governance of model use. And so the whole model risk management process provides a really valuable foundation for us to start from, because that process ensures things like, well, first of all, that process has at its heart, on the consumer side, protecting the consumer. And that's something that, you know, as a financial institution is actually really enabling for us. It's not in any sense a burden. It's really something that helps us do the right thing and know that we're doing the right thing for our customers. But secondly, it gives you this framework where as a model's developed in the first place, there are really clear guidelines around how you document every input piece of data, how you document every modeling decision that you've made, how you establish clear monitoring and document what you're looking for in the monitoring. And then you also have an independent, separate function within the organization that then reviews the process of creating that model, putting it into production, reviews the ongoing performance of that model. And then, you know, we are, as a financial services institution, we are examined on, you know, by the regulatory agencies on the effectiveness of our model governance. Now, I don't know that traditional model governance, in fact, I'm pretty confident that traditional model governance is not going to cover the whole waterfront for AI systems and the massive complexity and scale that we're now seeing with AI systems. But I do think it provides a useful foundation and an important body of accrued experience with these types of complex systems that we can use to kind of bootstrap our way into a model management system, if you like, and a model governance system for AI modules.
Thank you, Diane. That's very, very useful. Aleksander, you have your microphone on.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, thank you, Diane and Elam, for these points, and I think that they are straight on point. And I wanted to just first, you know, kind of call out on Elam for this like great effort that NIST is really leading to help us think about the framework. And I like how inclusive it is and tries to really understand the landscape before jumping to the conclusion that that's what it is. The one point I wanted to make, actually 2 points, kind of relate to something related, that why we should talk about objectives and terminology more. Again, this is not just a boring thing, you know, how to define things. I think this is an opportunity for at least 2 things. So the first thing, and this, you know, this might come as a surprise, but it's a surprise to me, but well, no longer, is that we need to actually even tell to ourselves and to the society that AI systems fail, that actually there is error, there always will be an error, and we need to figure out, you know, how, like, are we comfortable with this? What kind of error we are comfortable with? And remember, you know, yes, AI systems fail, humans fail as well. For humans, we figured out a way how to make peace with certain types of error, how to have a whole framework to kind of to deal with that. With, you know, if someone causes an accident, we know what to do. We know how to internalize that. I don't think we have any even idea how to approach this kind of questions for AI systems, and that's an opportunity to do that. And kind of tying back to the previous panel, I think it's also an opportunity to talk about our values. It's again, like, what are we, like, what role we want the AI systems to play in our role? It's like just, you know, to talk about consumer lending, right? Like, on one hand, you might say, you know, just, yes, we don't want to have this AI to advance because there are this, you know, dangers of some, you know, discrimination that we might not be able to audit. On the other hand, you need to recognize by using more advanced tools, we might make lending more inclusive. There is a trade-off to be made. You know, Diane will not make this decision. The society will need to make this decision. And that's something that kind of this terminology and objectives really kind of, it's a good opportunity to do that. The other aspect I want to say, I want to highlight is just, again, whatever terminology we come up with, is like, I think we all are aware that it needs to be adaptive. It will need to be kind of flexible. You know, there is no, like, even definition of AI, which was a discussion on the previous panel, like, I don't know what AI is, you know, like, kind of, you know, I know what it is when I see it, I guess, but otherwise I don't know. And we need to kind of figure out if we can have frameworks that can capture these things. And finally, as a scientist, I want to, you know, shout out to both points that, you know, Diane and Elham made, that, you know, these auditing systems, you know, yes, we develop them for this, you know, objectives of making sure that, you know, the society is kind of, you know, that the systems work well and for the goodness of society, the way we understand it. But also, I like the point about the science, like, essentially it forces us, so we are forcing ourselves to really make sure we understand, you know, how the systems work and what makes them tick, which, you know, I guess something that I am personally excited about.
Thank you very much, Aleksander. That is fascinating. and we will come back to more than one of your points in a second. But let me go to Renaud.
Yeah, I would like to concur to what has been just said. AI regulation is demanded by the public, by scientists, because of the whole of series of reasons that point to specific risk of contemporary AI systems, with the quality and representativeness of data, with the alignment of objective functions, and so on and so forth. And also because one has to recognize the compositional nature of AI systems. They are very rarely pure. There are often additional functionalities or embedded in processes or wider goods and services. So there's a hybridization there, nature of technological systems. And therefore, when we envisaged AI, it takes place, it's rooted in a legal space that pre-exists, as was said at the beginning. And this legal system is often very general and cross-cutting, and we have to revise it, and we have to embed AI regulation or control or analysis, at least in those frameworks. For example, in Europe, we have a single market which has been developed since 1957. It can be criticized on many aspects, but it is something that has ensured the free market and our prosperity. And it's strong. It's based on very strong rules that have logical meanings. Some are very cross-cutting, like consumer protection, as was said by earlier, or industrial product safety rules, or liability regimes in case of a damage. And AI, since AI can fail, as was said by Aleksander, we have to revise and apply those systems. And other of those regulations are sectoral, like vertical in transportations or in health products or in insurance or financial products. And so this is something you have to work out in a very matrix way, and it's very complicated. And least I also like to say that and to stress that we don't want to live in an algorithmically designed or automatic society. We have values, and when those regimes fail, or when they have disparate impact, or when AI systems can affect people very importantly, they should have redress rights. They should be able to question, and this is where we need to develop socio-technical systems that have human in the loop.
Thank you very much, Renaud. I want to go back to something that Aleksander said, and all of you alluded to, which is we know that AI systems, and in particular machine learning systems, can fail. And but let's acknowledge that they can fail in more than one way. It's not just an accuracy problem. It can be, as we know, it can be privacy breaches. It can be biases. It can be lack of robustness. I mean, there's a whole vector of problems. So a key problem seems to be that these are not always independent. So if you want to, so how to prioritize, and how to establish what thresholds of error are acceptable? Is there, as you work on dealing on a daily basis on these problems, how do you deal with this notion of these multifaceted or vectorial type of problem, which are not these problems are not independent from themselves. And as Aleksander said, there are trade-offs, and these trade-offs are very, very real. Ilham, please.
If I can go, yeah, thank you. As I was listening to all the great insights by the other panelists, I first want to echo what Aleksander said about zero error, zero risk doesn't exist. So the goal should not be eliminating, but mitigating, understanding, and having a plan for managing that. And then your point about the trade-off among them. So it's not only we cannot zero out one of them, even if we try to minimizing errors, there's going to be trade-offs to be made. So it goes back again to the approach we're taking with AI RMF, which again, I have to give a shout out to all of the, and thank you, Aleksander, for your shout out to everybody that helped us to get to this point. And Diane, to your point about financial sector being ahead with all of the work about the governance and SR 11-7 is a guide for us, and we could go back and look at it. And part of that is actually you would see bits of that in the draft AI RMF. But that's Luis, the question that you ask goes again back to terminology and taxonomy to understand what are the risks are when you want to look at the trade-off. What are the things that you need to look at, and then you ask question about the risk threshold. So I think it's important to know, what questions to ask, having the same lexicon, the same language, that when you're talking about AI risks, what those are, what are the right questions to ask, and how to talk that we are not past each other. You mentioned accuracy, reliability, robustness, resilience, in addition to that, privacy, safety, mitigation of bias, but also explainability and interpretability. And in a way, these are the translations of the values and the principles that we see in many of the documents, and have the right methods and tools for cost-benefit analysis at the end. So whatever is the objective of the systems, do the right cost-benefit analysis. Our approach in AI RMF is that we don't provide threshold for risks. Instead, just the building blocks for understanding risks, for a lexicon terminology, hopefully methods and metrics for assessing each of them, to have enough information to make the right decision about the risk, because the different applications, the different entities have different risk appetite. And basically, it's important to understand the consequences, both positive and negative, of the AI systems, to understand who is impacted by what degree, where are the source of impacts, and try to come up with a plan for managing all these different risks to maximize benefits and minimize risks.
Thank you. Anybody wants to address the question on thresholds and the trade-offs? Diane?
Yeah, I was, so first of all, I just think that the comments that Elhan made are really spot on. And just from a kind of practitioner's lens, I think, and this also builds on the point that Renaud was making, the model exists, and within a larger process. It's never sort of just this model that's like on its own with its data running, right? Because the data's always come from multiple complex sources, and it's producing as an output, not a yes, no, not an answer. It's producing a probability. And so there is always a human overlay on top of the models. I think at some point, will we get to a point where there aren't human overlays? I don't know. But there are always human overlays, which are, in some cases they're regulatory rules, in some cases it's human oversight, in some cases it's processes that are designed to ensure that you have that human part of the whole process that's operating in concert with the model. And so we have, as Renaud said, we have a very much a hybrid system. I do want to emphasize, though, that as we see the scale of models increasing, so, a typical model that might be used for transaction fraud has literally hundreds of data inputs that are streaming in real time. In real time, those data inputs are getting combined into hundreds, if not thousands, of complex factors. And sometimes there's a machine learning model that's creating those factors. And then, the model that's making the decision around fraud is running and producing an answer. And so the volume of what you practically have to monitor there is vast, because you have to make sure there are no interruptions, discontinuities, no long-term drift in the data that's going into the model. You have to make sure there isn't, a glitch somewhere in the technology that's causing something not to work right this morning. You have to make sure that your outputs are within reasonable bounds, and so on. And that monitoring by itself is generating massive, massive streams of data. And sometimes the only way to detect the noise in those massive streams of monitoring data is actually to use another model on top of it. And so there, and it may be a very simplistic model, just some simple time series looking for a big change or whatever, or it may be a very complex model. Typically, they're complex models because you've got streams of thousands of data points, and the thousands of data points are all correlated with each other. So it is you have to really have a broad systems approach. There are enormous, I don't believe that technologically yet we have really gotten a good handle on, fully instrumenting models, fully understanding their performance. There's enormous technical challenge in really understanding what's going on. And as Alex has said in previous conversations, if you truly need a machine learning model to understand it, the likelihood that it can be simply explained is very, very low. And I think we, in human words, I think we have to grapple with that. So I think it's very important to understand that there's quite a big gap right now between our aspiration for fully instrumenting and documenting and describing how a model behaves and the actual technical capability to do that. And that is an enormous challenge. And that's why the hybrid approaches and the human oversight remains so very, very critical.
Yeah, thank you. That's extremely insightful. It's a great segue to the next set of questions I wanted to move on, which is the technological feasibility, because we are talking about auditing and monitoring systems, but there's a fundamental question, which is it even feasible technologically? Can we actually do it? And what you just said is hinting that maybe not yet. I'd like to go to anybody in the panel who wants to speak about it. Maybe Aleksander, can you share your thoughts on the technical feasibility? Are we there yet? Is it even, or will we ever be there?
Okay, so that's a great question, and the short answer: we are not there yet. Whether we ever be, I think that really depends. It's a dynamic process because it involves, as Roberto said, it's not only about what we can do, what the smart people, in academia and industry come up with, but also what are our expectations. And I think they need to meet over time. So maybe the broader point here that I want to make is that this is the role that in particular, I view the role of scientists here, is that our job is, of course, on one hand, advance what we can do. And but there is an advance, what we can do, what are the trade-offs, but there is also the other role that I think we really need to take more seriously, is to communicate the state of the art and these trade-offs to the policymakers. Because in the end, as we already discussed, we will not be making there will be some hard decisions to be made. We should not be making them as scientists or industry people. We are not equipped to do it. Yes, there is a question of legitimacy of a choice and so on. So that's what the policymaker needs to do. And there is kind of some very important mission of communicating all of that. So that's what I guess we are doing in AI Policy Panel. But yes, having said that, I think we are making some good progress in terms of trying to understand why machine learning systems work, but it is really difficult to do so. Again, these systems, as Diane said, whenever ML kind of does something non-trivial, it's non-trivial for a reason, and it is doing something we can't do. So it will not be that easy necessarily to understand what they are doing, and we need to just reconcile with this. So in particular, when I talk a lot to people in different domains about this question of AI auditing and kind of making sure it's trustworthy, what I realize is that people tend to come into that, if they never work with AI, they come into that conversation thinking of this, this is like certifying cars or certifying airplanes. That yes, someone comes in, does some measurement, does some tests, and then signs, okay, seal of approval, this is a product, you can use it safely. So I can fairly confidently tell you this will never happen. This is the completely wrong way of thinking. The way to think about AI auditing is about as an AI monitoring, really. So in particular, if I wanted to draw a parallel of what I hope we will converge to, is not, we will have some FAA that will be certifying, the AI systems, but would be more of how we deal with, with the question of trustworthiness in the medical domain. So there is no definition for a doctor of what a correct treatment for a flu is. There's just a set of principles. There is some kind of growing and changing knowledge of what practices work and not. And the way we get trustworthiness is by we know that there is a whole process that someone is liable if something goes wrong, and and there's a way to escalate any problems and essentially counteract them. So if there is some treatment that turns out to actually be harmful, well, hopefully eventually we will catch up to this. There will be a study and now say, okay, you should not be doing that, because we realize that there is something new about this very complex machinery of human body that we did not know about. So essentially, I think that's that's where we that's where we need to do. And the other point is that, just again, this is the other point that I'm finding when talking about technical feasibility, is that people kind of have this attitude that this technology, it is developed, like it just exists. And now our job is to make sure to explain how it works, to make sure it works well. I think we should turn tables a little bit and says, well, the technology is something that we have a control over. So we might actually insist that the type of models we use, the type of data we use, is actually makes it easier for us to decide, to make sure that they are trustworthy. So anyway, so as you see, even though I work very much on the technical side of this, I always, whenever I get into this question, I recognize that me alone, I cannot really approach this question, because there is a bit of a bigger conversation that needs to happen.
Thank you, Aleksander. I really want to hear from Renaud on this question. And we've talked a little bit about with Ilham on the risk management framework that NIST is developing in the US. Europe is creating a very robust legal framework for data and AI, starting with GDPR, later on the agreement. There are already agreements on the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. And now the European AI Act is coming. And in that act, there's not, the word auditing is not part of the act, but there's this obligation to do conformity assessments, pre-market and then controls post-market. So the notion that models need to be methodically examined throughout their life cycle is very much in the European framework. Not for all AI systems, but only for those that are deemed high risks by the law. In a context where there are so many uncertainties and there are so many unknowns, Renaud, as a policymaker, how do you move forward with creating such a framework with so many questions, technical questions that remain unanswered?
Well, I think first of all, you have to accept that you develop a law, a model, but it will be only gradually enforced. And you have to take steps. First, the mindset of organization. Second, maybe regulating the processes, and then going down to the bottom of things in typical products or services. And if you want an effective regulatory system, if you want to move people, at some point, you need maybe to exert a certain amount of pressure against abuses or negligence. So you need a governance that bites a little, but not too much, not to the point to hinder innovation. And so auditing and monitoring can be used either as a precondition of putting into service on the market. That will be one retained by the AI Act. It could be also a question of qualifying for insurance, and I'm sure that insurers of liability damages for products will ask their share to protect themselves. And then you also need to have response answers when there is a damage that needs proper investigation backwards for compensation, or when somebody will complain for discrimination biases. So you have those occasions to have the thing. So the drivers are there. Then you will have to negotiate about the false positive and false negative problems. And there will be an asymmetric determination of thresholds. It will depend on the context, on the algorithmic model, and on the irreversibility of damage when the risk is materialized. So you will not have a one fits all answer to false positive or false negative problems or crashes of AI systems. And in certain ones, you need to impose a human oversight and responsibility when negative answers to people are, for instance, like obtaining a loan or getting admitted to a certain thing in public services. You could have an automatic system for positive answers and a human one for negative answers. You could imagine very many difficulties. But in the end, I think we should not be too overly pessimistic, because in our legal systems, statistical issues have long been known. And, in the liability principles, you have this distinction between a liability for fault or negligence, and it has to remain on the supplier or the user's responsibility to impose improvement and action. And on the same time, we sometimes negotiate at the social level what we do, what we mean, like when there's something like that happened by random or bad luck, or is linked to the intrinsic limit of the technology, which is the regime of no-fault liability. And I'm sure that we'll be able to negotiate in some parts when we apply little by little some such regimes, and then we will be able to cover the risks when we cannot prevent or mitigate totally those risks.
Thank you very much, Renaud. Let me, and you touch on one of the main challenges, which is dealing with deterministic legal systems and probabilistic tools. Yeah. And as you say, there's a tradition from liability law that could be useful in different legal systems, not only in Europe. Let me move into a more practical question, and perhaps a more simplistic one, but we think it's very important, which is who's going to do all this auditing? If we think only of high-risk systems, and let's go with the European AI Act list, which includes things like healthcare, finance, hiring, admissions, criminal justice, autonomous vehicles, and food, energy. Leave out all the non-high stakes systems. And if you start doing a back of the envelope calculation about how many systems are being deployed and will be deployed in the near future, you very quickly get to hundreds of thousands of systems. Who's going to do the audits? Who's going to train the auditors? Who's going to set the standards for auditing? This seems to be a very pedestrian question as compared to the complex technological and almost unphilosophical things we were discussing a few minutes ago. But it seems to be a very important practical challenge for policy making. Ilham, I'd love to start with you and your thoughts on how to scale our auditing capabilities and where to find the auditors.
Right, and add to the level of complexity, I just want to echo what Aleksander said about continuous monitoring. So it's not one of the things that you do at one time and put a seal or a certificate on it, but something that needs to be continuous monitoring. My personal view is that this is actually a really good use of standards. Standards that can come up with the good guidance on what the metrics are, what characteristics that the test data set ought to have, because it's easy to do these things with the easy data sets and everybody wins or pass the test, or the very difficult data sets and everybody fails. So how to get the right data sets for the test that represent all sorts of failures or parts that needs to be tested. So I personally think that having good, solid standards and guidance on how these things ought to be done allows for what is it? You know, self-certification. But I want to use the word certification, but sort of self-testing by the entities. And that goes back to a lot of things that Diane mentioned at the beginning, about the governance, about the processes, about having the right culture of wanting to understand risk, wanting to measure and manage risk, and not just do it because it's a checklist to check boxes, but do this because it's important to understand those risks and to try to have a plan to manage and mitigate the risks. So if we get this right, if we avoid risk management to be an afterthought, but build it as a culture into the things that ought to be done, I think a lot of these things becomes a lot easier. And I also want to highlight another point that Aleksander made. I think that the role of making technologies that are rights preserving by design. So instead of trying to help with preserving privacy after the technology is deployed, or worry about what we can do or what we should not do. How about bringing our brilliant scientists in the US and places like MIT and everywhere to think about how to build models that are privacy preserved by design. The same thing for security. Instead of this perpetual cycle of defense and attack, that for any defense there is an attack in a very short time after that. That goes to a lot of really good research that Aleksander and his team at MIT and others are doing. How about we build models that we know theoretically what are the about the resilience of those things. So I would say that while in the short time we have to worry about all of the practical questions that you asked, but in a longer term we can think about good, technically, scientifically valid standards that allow these things to be done as part of the technology development and routine continuous monitoring of technology, but also the bigger shift of making it a culture of designing and developing technologies that are rights preserving by design, by development, rather than making them afterthought.
Thank you, Ilham, and that certainly charts a way forward, and which is very, very promising and encouraging. I would like to stay a little bit before moving on into the next topic. I would like to stay on the scalability question, because I think that we don't think enough about it. Renaud or Aleksander, maybe Renaud, any thoughts on the scalability challenge?
Well, I think, yes, we have to be realistic and pragmatic. So in the AI, for instance, there are at least 5 ways so that we can manage feasibility and scalability. The first mindset is to limit the obligation to very high-risk systems and only those, and to manage a responsive definition of those in both directions, in enlargement and in diminution when things are stabilized. The second thing is that we should shoulder on existing regulators in transportation systems, in health systems, in banking systems. They are already regulators. They need to accommodate themselves with AI. They need some probably to hire or train people with AI methods and evaluations, and those methods need to be established. But we do not need to necessarily set up new regulators, except in those domains like human resources or AI in the workforce or in housing, where regulation does not exist. The third thing would be to allow time for methods to be developed, including by a private sector. That's why there will be a 2 years minimum delay after the publication of AI Act before the obligations are to be enforced. It will give companies and developers a time to adjust, to prepare. And so it means that the AI Act will not probably in full force before 2025 or 2026. The fourth thing is to standardize methods. I completely agree with what Ilham has just said. And in the AI Act, there is this notion of application of standards. When you respect a standard that has been recognized and published as satisfying, then there is a presumption of respect of the whole obligations. And this is a very good method because it's standardized, and so it makes like patterns or models in a certain industry to follow. And the last thing is to be pragmatic when a new problem arises, and when the AI system is not developed at full scale with systemic impact. And in those cases, you would need to resort to innovation preservation systems like sandboxing in order to be able to develop for 1 or 2 years another system without forbidding necessarily the putting on the market of the system. That I think are the 5 methods to be able to scale and to have sufficient time. And of course, there will be the human resources problem, and this means obviously training people not only to develop AI systems, but also to certify or assess them.
Thank you, Renaud, for sharing such a comprehensive framework of these 5 elements towards capacity building and scalability. Aleksander and Diane, I think you wanted to say something, Aleksander?
Sure. Although I really would love to hear from Diane, because she is, living and breathing it. So I hope I'm not putting her on the spot. But just like a couple of comments. So this was like a element, like this were really good. These were the really good comments and way of thinking about this. I must say though that, okay, first of all, this all, and that's what Bruno said, this comes back to what we think, what auditing should be about, and kind of, what we want to audit to, like where are we comfortable, like to not audit versus where we said, okay, this absolutely has to happen. And I really like, again, as much as I'm sure Diane and her team is very creative about like getting more sophisticated tools for this context, like it will never be a kind of push button turnkey solution. So there will really need to be some personnel that needs to operate them. Again, with the right development, the right culture. I really like this call out to culture that Ella made. We can make this, maybe you don't have to be like, PhD, MIT researcher, ML researcher to do any of that, but you will need some training. So I still worry where this will come from, because again, yes, banking figured it out, but this does not come cheap. Like I'm sure Diane can attest to that. Medicine also figured it out, but it definitely didn't come cheap. And even creating enough of human capital, human capacity to do that, it took us decades. It's like we did this only gradually. So I think there is some thinking that goes beyond just, like on the technological and even legislative front. Like we should thinking it as a kind of some critical infrastructure investment that needs to happen. And by the way, there is a silver lining here, because we are worried about AI displacing people from jobs. Maybe this is one way of some of these jobs kind of trickle back into the economy. And yeah, so essentially, I guess the last thing I want to say is just that, yeah, it's very clear that we will need to cut a compromise here somewhere. The only thing I would like to happen is that this is a compromise that is proactive. We think of it now, as opposed to reactive. Just say, okay, we need to give up because essentially like it's too difficult and we just cut something that is very haphazard.
Thank you, Aleksander. Before going to Diane, just a reminder to our audience that we will take some questions from the audience before the end of the panel. So please submit any questions we have. Let's go to Diane.
Yeah, I think, I agree very, very strongly with and with Alex's point that what's really important here is the culture and the human capital. And that's why, as a practitioner today, I still say, we've got a lot of human eyes and human hands on all of our ML implementations, because at the end of the day, these are such consequential decisions that we're making, that human oversight and really starting with a lens of what's the right thing to do for our customers is absolutely critical and foundational. I think one thing as well, I agree with Alex that we have a shortage of human capital in the ML space, and that we really, you see that if you just look at what's going on in the, in the US labor market, and the incredible demand for those skills, and the, the premium that people with those skills can command in the labor market. And I think what that's leading to as well is a process whereby ML capabilities are increasingly being sold as a service to other companies, so that companies that are using ML and AI solutions are essentially buying black box solutions from other providers. And there are some really good things in that, because it means you've got that kind of concentration of expertise, and the people who are providing the solutions, hopefully really know what they're doing. You've got some challenges in that, again, in terms of potentially creating a concentration of risk. And again, in terms of potentially thinking about, what does a governance regime look like? Who's accountable for what? When you have companies with limited human capital and expertise in this area, who are then dependent on third parties. You also get into sort of long chains of models. As I mentioned before, you can get sort of models sitting on top of models sitting on top of models. And it's possible for some of those models not to actually be owned and operated by the enterprise that is using them in the end result. And that also then creates additional complexity. And so I think you really have to have a kind of systems, ecosystem view that includes you know, it's the trite old three of looking at, you know, yes, you got to look at the technology, but you've also got to look really hard at the people and the processes to really fully understand and govern this area.
Diane, you just touched on a recent trend in AI deployment that we care a lot about here at the AI Policy Forum, which is the vertical fragmentation of the AI supply chain, in which, as you described, what you described pretty much sounds like a AI being delivered by a B to B to B to B to eventually C supply chain. It's not just a B2C event anymore. It's a lot more complex, and that raises a whole set of questions. I would like to and this is reinforced by the emergence of very large base models or foundation models that sit at the top of the supply chains and are starting to become critical inputs for the AI supply chain. I'd like to go to Aleksander, because you think a lot about this, Aleksander. And what challenges, but also maybe opportunities, can this bring to the auditing of AI as being deployed in our world?
Yes, so thank you. So in many ways, yeah, Diane already did my job for me, because she really nicely described what we are observing is happening. Is that, again, it's quite funny, because in research, you know, most of the paper that I write and other people write is about this kind of, you know, one-stage deployment of model, that you gather the data, you develop the model, and then you deploy it. And that's very convenient when you think about the, you know, trying to do machine learning as a science, but it's increasingly at odds and kind of divergent to what is actually happening. So, you know, as Diane said, even within an organization, you know, you will never do like one-shot learning of a model directly on the data that you have. You probably do some, well, first of all, you do maybe transfer learning, because you have like maybe some bigger model and bigger data that kind of allows you to train this, like, you know, the initial model, but then you kind of fine tune it to specific tasks for which you have less data. But then, as Diane said, you also build like systems on top of the systems on top of the systems. And, you know, as Diane also said, you know, some of the systems actually might not be in your organization, it might be somewhere else. And by the way, I just also want to call out that some of the data might not be coming from you as well. And you might get multiple vendors, and, you know, and that's, you know, and that's additional kind of piece of the puzzle. So all of this, I think, is really something that we need to think very, very hard about, you know, how to think about auditing. Because again, from the point of view of liability, so, okay, so, you know, if you are a bank, right, but you are having all this, you know, all this maybe the potential, you know, external suppliers that provide some of your data or some of your models, or and so on, like, well, are you underwriting all the risks that kind of, you know, the client faces? Or if so, then what can and should you require your vendors to tell you about the model they develop, so you are able to do your part, you know? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that many of these problems, kind of, you know, like the one thing that we don't understand very well in AI systems is the composition, like how they compose. So essentially, like, it might be thinking that like each of the building blocks seems to work exactly right, but somehow once you piece them together, there are some very strange interactions. So again, if these are interactions with the components that are not even owned by the same organization, no, even in big organizations, you know, even the two different groups, there can be a lot of kind of problems there, and kind of how to think about these problems is kind of something that we really need to think about. So, you know, one other aspect that I want to highlight is actually, okay, so so far we talked about the business and business facing the clients, the consumers. But what on the other side? So if I am a consumer, if I kind of go to a bank and get a loan, how I am supposed to even know that I might be potentially mistreated by this, you know, by the system? So in particular, think about, you know, I go to one bank and my loan application gets rejected. Happens, you know, but then I go to another and it also gets rejected, and another. At which point will I start thinking, oh, maybe what's happening? Maybe there is essentially all these banks are using the same vendor to supply the model for, you know, for loan evaluation. And maybe I just got unlucky that in data set that this vendor has, you know, I correlate with something that leads to negative decisions. So this kind of would be a systemic discrimination. So first of all, this can happen and we need to think about it. But like, how would I, as a client, like, how would I even realize that? Okay, I know machine learning, but most people don't, essentially there's a whole question of like thinking of maybe we should have a new tort law that kind of allows us, to get some lawyers that understand AI to kind of inquire on our behalf. So anyway, there's a lot of questions here, that I see. So this is kind of definitely like something that will keep us busy for a while. I also see opportunities there, right? And the opportunity is that saying, okay, and this is kind of tying back to what Diane said about consultation of experts. So if really like maybe there's just a few, core models that are used by everyone, well, maybe then we can really put a lot of effort into really understanding what these particular models are doing. And this way, kind of, we can have less, kind of essentially we can have just a few key points where, we need to address from the point of view of auditing. Maybe this will help with the scalability problem here. So that's an opportunity here that we could address. I'm not sure if we can realize it, but definitely something to consider. So, but anyway, I really find this question fascinating. There is like many, many other implications beyond policy that, that this development brings.
Thank you, Aleksander. If auditing an ML system is already complex, this multi-layer deployment is even more complex, so the question becomes more interesting. Renaud, we'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yes, I understand the B2B to B2C problem and the problem facing the last consumer, the users. I think even if we cannot mitigate today completely the problems, we can give instrumental rights to users from the onset. First, he has to know the right that he has been subject to an algorithmic system. That is a simple basic right, but it's not always big enforced in all dimensions of users. Second, explainability, at least what is the general functioning of the systems, its main use, its intervals of confidence, where it should be used, where it should not be used. And third, in some dimensions which can have a very important adverse effect on people, on their lives, sometimes there should be a right to be to contest before a human an algorithmic decisions. And this exists already in the public service, and maybe it should also sometimes be decided for private services like credit loans or insurance or others. And the last thing also I would like to say is that we should strive, and we need, if we want to develop and increase AI, fragmentation of digital markets, and this could happen if our legal systems diverge or are not interoperable. And that's why last weekend a very important decisions have been taken in the Transatlantic Trade Council, for instance, to agree on at least interoperable approaches for managing AI risks, and also to share hubs or repository of metrics and methodologies for measuring AI trustworthiness and AI risks. And I think this is a very interesting result, because maybe if I am optimistic, it will help Europe to be sometimes a bit more pragmatic and not only see things through a legal viewpoint, and also maybe it will increase the dialogue with other states, and especially with North America, which is a leading actor in AI. Thank you.
Diane, on the fragmentation of the supply chain, you already mentioned it, and you live through it. How do you navigate in practice with this increasingly fragmented B2B to B2C supply chain?
Well, one thing I wanted to point out that I think is tremendously important to recognize is that in the United States, we have a body of regulation and law that we broadly describe as fairness in lending. And the standard for fairness in lending is that whatever the process you're using is to come up with a lending decision. So to answer Alex's example, is that there should not be disparate outcomes in that process. So for a set of protected classes, for example, gender, race, you should be able to demonstrate that if you look across the loan decisions that were made, the outcome should not be disparate. And so that is one of the most important governance processes, one of the most important things. And certainly at Capital One, we really regard that as an absolute priority for us to always get that oversight and governance right. And I think this is the place where, you know, to the points that were made earlier, this is the place where you really see the importance of the values, and where it really becomes about what are our social values around the decisions that we're making, whether that's in the financial system, whether that's in healthcare, you know, and what are we prepared to accept and what are we prepared not to accept. I do believe it's very, very important, you know, to have human oversight of these complex decisioning systems. At the same time, I would also caution us that human review has often not proved a satisfactory resolution to these issues. And so, you know, if you just think about the history of fair credit and lending in the United States, where we saw the greatest issues with disparate outcome was in fact when the decisions were largely human-made. So human oversight certainly doesn't guarantee that you're going to achieve outcomes that are in accordance with our broader social goals and values. So I think we have to be just super careful and super thoughtful about how we create a set of integrated processes that are really understanding, as I said before, the technology angle, the people angle, and the broader process angle, and the policies and governance that are required. I did, though, just want to jump in and highlight that there are existing mechanisms for around fair lending practice. The question of how any one individual understands whether they have been, you know, whether they've experienced an algorithmic outcome that's unfair, I think is, you know, it's a little bit to the analogy that Alex made earlier. It's the same as how does anyone understand whether their healthcare treatment was appropriate or not. So it's a broader set of social issues.
Thank you very much, Diane. Let me go to a couple of questions from the audience as we are approaching the end of the panel. And please, for any of the panelists, feel free to jump. I think this one is particularly interesting. So auditing needs to gather data about how the system performs, the data that was used, and so forth. Auditability, therefore, means storing data. How to reconcile this storage of data? Diane, you mentioned that is in the early part of the panel with privacy risks. Is there a tension between auditability and privacy? And perhaps Renaud, you can because the conformity assessments are now part of the European framework, but Europe also has a very strong privacy protection framework. So are these two objectives in tension, or can they be done in a complementary way?
I totally agree with what you've suggested. They are intentions, definitely, like all principles in AI, like efficiency and biasness, and so we will need to be we need to forge trade-offs, and I'm sure we'll have the delights of fruitful conversations between the data protection authorities and other regulators. And sometimes even it could be conflicts within themselves, because in Europe, some data protection authorities would like to be the ones enforcing the AI Act. So we'll have to recognize those trade-offs. To be honest, I think we don't have yet dived very deep into those trade-offs as far as privacy risk is concerned. In the AI Act, there is this obligation of keeping data logs, but we definitely will definitely need to be more precise behind the high-level principle and obligation.
Thank you, Renaud. Let me go to an interesting question, and this is more US-based, and it's about how would tort law be applied in this field, and would these fall more on companies who use the AI systems, or the companies that develop the AI systems, or as we see in a fragmented supply chain, how does this apply? Where is the we already touched on this question, but how do we define the accountability, where in the supply chain it should be, and how to deal with the seams, with the transitions between one supplier and the other. Maybe Aleksander?
Yes, so well, I am happy to join this question. I am not sure I know, how to answer it. So Diane already mentioned. So there is this kind of aspect of, like, actually, again, I really like this analogy to medical healthcare, because it also goes here. Yes, there is a tort law, like for people who are patients who just think that they were victims of of malpractice. And of course, in the end, there is, it's complicated. It's a very complicated thing to decide if there is a malpractice or not. But we have framework for that, and it includes, tort law there. So but the difference that I see between AI systems and healthcare is that, like, I think with healthcare we can actually, maybe that's not true, but it's easier for us to see harm. But I guess if I get my loan application rejected multiple times, I also will start to suspect that something is up. So I guess then I worry about situations where this may not be as obvious to me, that that potentially I might be a victim of some algorithmic AI malpractice. So essentially, I think again, from my part of the field, I definitely want to understand exactly how can we understanding this interaction of different components at the seams. In particular, much of my even research right now is about understanding the impact on data on the downstream predictions. And again, there are some really wonderful but also scary from the legislation point of view interactions where there might be a situation where there is a model that was trained for let's say think core model that was trained on data, and again without any agenda in mind, but it might have some biases because every data has biases. And then there is this model is then used to transfer learn for some other task, and actually for that particular task you can think very essentially you make sure that the data you are using for this fine-tuning is does not have the spurious correlations or the biases you want. So you think you are good, you did your part. Still, it turns out that whatever was happening in this core model can percolate all the way to your final model without even you realizing that. So essentially, unfortunately, my role here is just to make it even more scary, apparently, because that's what we are discovering. So I'm just waiting for solutions now.
Thank you, Aleksander. Let me go to, and perhaps this is the last question, and I would like to go to Elham. And because you started the panel with a very useful notion that I strongly agree with, which is we've got to measure, and everything starts with properly measuring. And a member of the audience presents an interesting question, which is, as autonomous systems, as intelligent systems gain autonomy, how can we keep up with measuring the ethical alignment as the systems become more and more autonomous?
Yeah, excellent. And I'm going to follow Aleksander lead, saying that I'm going to join that question because I don't have a good answer for that. But here is, here is what I want to kind of listening to everybody, the points that that I took and the notes that I take, that it's encouraging that there is a large body of work that exists. Diane mentioned some of them in the financial sector. Aleksander mentioned some of them in the medical domain that we can leverage and we can learn from them. The point about multidisciplinary that I think Aleksander talked about them and several other people, that it's not just a job of the scientists and technologists to come up with the solutions. We have to bring the lawyers, we have to bring the cognitive scientists in to help us get to the point, get to where we want to get. And the fact that there is a lot of questions, a lot of really important questions, just as this question that as the AI becomes more autonomous, how we continue testing that. These are all really good questions that I'm hoping by having a multidisciplinary approach, by bringing all the different type of thoughts, the diversity of thoughts, gets us to the opportunity to actually make a really good impact in the technology today and the future. I keep saying that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we just built systems and built models or built technologies because we could. it's great that now we are thinking about the impact of that, and we are having all these important questions about should we, how to make sure that it's in the benefits of the society and individuals, and we care about the impact of that. So again, on that point, I try to give a little bit a positive spin by joining Aleksander and saying that I don't know the answer, but I think that it's encouraging that there is a ton of opportunity in front of us and a lot of really goodwill across very many different domains to come to get to answer to those questions.
Thank you so much, Elham. Let me end with a question for all of you, and I would like, if possible, for all of you to provide a short answer to this question. It is actually a question that comes from Israel. And the question is very simple. So what's the call to action? It seems that we all agree that auditing is really important, that it will have to happen. It's already happening, and it will have to be done better. But how will we move from acknowledging the complexity and even admiring the problem and actually do next steps? Can you provide your preferred 1 or 2 steps of action that we, and when I say we as society, should move forward? What is the call to action following this discussion? And anybody who's willing to jump first, I know it's a difficult question, but it's an important one.
Okay, I'll go first. I'll go say that bolster and strengthen the ecosystem of research to build strong and valid scientific foundations for technically sound standards that can get us to better innovations and better rules and policy.
Thank you, Hannah. Renaud?
I think we should not underestimate the very powerful strength of very simple facts to enable auditing. First, we need to ask the developers to state the intended goals of the system they developed. Second, we need them to ask them to trace the data they have used. Third, we need them to develop a risk management framework to think about all possible anticipated negative consequences. And last, we should ask them to report the incidents so that they will be incentivized to correct them. And I think those very 4 simple rules can improve a lot the possibility of auditing.
Thank you, Renaud. Aleksander?
Yes, so I would actually say, so there are like 3 steps, which again are a little bit not fully defined, but like you say, and now, like, I think the first step is to actually acknowledge we have a problem. Like, I don't think this is something that is universally acknowledged. Like, again, if you look at legislation, it just says, oh, we will audit, done. So I think really recognizing, I guess that's what we are doing today, is that this is actually a problem that we don't even know is a problem, or we don't broadly enough understand this is a problem. Like, I think that's the first step. The other one, which kind of follows it, is just start a conversation. So kind of figure out, this is, and I'm now saying for academia, this is why we started AAPF, is that, that academia is not very good to, for instance, talking to the policymakers, like meaning, and again, this does not mean, like, what is the role of academia here is like, it does not mean that we are supposed to be lobbying for any solutions. That's not our job, but we should be maybe even the conveners, like we provide the technical input. We are the conveners, and we are also the communicators that kind of essentially can explain to policymakers and others, but because it's not only about policymakers, it's about all the stakeholders, what is at stake here, what are the problems, and and essentially ask them to like help us together come up with an answer. And the third step is, which again, I don't know how to do it properly because it's a very precarious step in some way, is I think, and again, I'm really excluding the finance industry from now, because actually they are actually very good players in this space so far. Is I think the rest of the industry that uses AI, they really need to pay attention to this, and maybe they need to be brought to pay attention. Like in some ways, again, every business has a fiduciary responsibility to just essentially do what is good for the company. So even if there are well-meaning people in there, like there might need to be some push for them, some pressure exerted to really encourage us to really grapple with this question seriously, because there's an immense innovation potential there, and they are the people doing it. So thinking about like how to build up such pressure without trying to constrain and kind of try to oversteer it, that would be very important. So what Renaud mentions, like reporting incidents, that these are all the ways that really kind of force the particular big tech to kind of pay more attention as opposed to paying lip service to this question.
Thank you, Aleksander. Diane, you have the final word.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I would love to say that I love Renaud's 4 very simple rules. I think they steer us in a really great direction. My advice to practitioners would be to first of all ask yourself a really hard question, which is this really the right space to introduce a complex model that you might not understand all the way and that might prove very costly to monitor and govern? So I think that has to be the first question. Just because you can do something, it doesn't mean you should do something. And I think that speaks to organizational culture and making sure that you've got a strong culture in the organization that is focused on doing the right thing for your customers, and really asking that hard question about, is this the right thing to do for our customers? I think the second thing is, wherever possible, actually to try and simplify the systems so that the long supply chains we've talked about, some of the possibility of inherited effects and so on, so that in the overall problem of monitoring and governance is it's exponential. As the system becomes more complex, the monitoring and governance becomes exponentially more complex. And so, really asking yourself, do you need this extra tweak, this extra bell, this extra whistle? Is that really going to improve the customer experience? Or is that just simply going to increase the risks of undesirable outcomes and untrustworthiness in the overall system?
Thank you, Diana. Thank you all. This has been a great panel. On behalf of the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing and the AI Policy Forum, we are honored to have you on board, the 4 of you. And I've learned a lot, and I hope this was useful to the audience. And back to you, David. Thank you very much to all of you.
And thank you, Luis, Elham, Renaud, Diane, and Aleksander. That was fantastic. So this morning, we've covered 2 of those cross-cutting issues that are driving AI policy: the development of laws and regulations on AI systems, and how we can start to approach auditing the technology to determine whether it can actually comply. Now, coming up, we're going to dive deeper into the verticals, some of the most important areas where AI is actually being used today, in the midst of already well-developed public policy, and where we're being asked as societies to reconcile this new technology and existing law. But before we do that, we're going to have a brief break for lunch, at least for those who are on the East Coast. And so we'll reconvene here at the same link at 1 p.m. Eastern time, so just about an hour and 10 minutes, to go deeper into AI in healthcare and mobility. So thanks to all of you who joined us this morning. Don't miss this afternoon's sessions coming up in just over 1 hour's time. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.